Hello, and welcome to Secure Talk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Secure Talk. This is your host, Justin Beals. I'm certainly happy to have you joining us today. We have an excellent guest on the podcast today. I'm very excited to talk with her. Sheryl Hsu is currently a student at Stanford University. She spent time as a researcher for the Stanford Empirical Security Research Group, where she recently published a paper titled "What is in the Chrome Web Store? Investigating Security-Noteworthy Browser Extensions," along with her co-authors Manda Tran and Aurore Fass. Sheryl, thanks for joining the podcast today. We're really glad to have you on it.
Thank you. It's an honor.
All right. Excellent. Sheryl, am I right that you recently gave a presentation on this paper in Singapore, I think, at a conference? Is that correct?
Yeah, literally just last week.
Wow. That's
We're
amazing.
at the Asia CCS conference. Yeah.
Yeah. How was it received? Did you enjoy the conference?
Yeah, I think the conference was really good. A lot of really interesting work. And I think one of the nice things about our paper, and that it's kind of like a broad overview, is that it can impact a lot of people. And it's something that a lot of people can use since it's quite a broad study.
Well, I certainly was, after reading your paper, looking through all the Chrome extensions that I've installed and thinking about, largely my team and how we're kind of managing this. It is certainly an interesting way to inject malware or other types of issues. And I think as you describe it, I love the definition, security-noteworthy extensions was like a great description. Before we get too deep into some of your research work that you're doing recently, I'd love to just learn a little bit about your background and what kind of inspired you to enter the field of computer science.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm originally from the Bay Area. So obviously kind of growing up in the heart of Silicon Valley, a lot of tech. But I think from a young age, I just really loved building things. I have photos of me building a fishing rod out of markers and tape. And so I think engineering and just kind of being able to create things was just a really natural fit. I just love the process of kind of dreaming of something, imagining something, and then slowly seeing it come to life through all of the work you put in and assembling each piece. And then computer science is just really cool because you can build and develop so quickly compared to other forms of engineering, where in one day you can literally have something that's really useful to yourself or useful to others. So it's just really exciting.
Yeah, I think that's why I got interested in it as well, both from two aspects. I like taking things apart and putting them together. So I wanted to know how software worked and computers worked. But then I love, like you mentioned, this idea that I could kind of rapidly create an interesting idea and put it out in the market and see how it does. How long have you been studying at Stanford now?
2 years.
2 years.
I'm halfway through.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, halfway through is downhill, right? Or it gets harder at the end, one of the two.
You dream bigger.
Yes, that's right. And it seems like you've got a deep focus on the machine learning side in kind of the education work that you're doing. Yeah. Do you just think that's the momentum for a lot of students today? A lot of your peers, that's just where computer science is going, where the innovation is at?
Yeah, definitely. It feels like a lot of people are very interested in machine learning. I think there's definitely just so much hype and excitement in the air.
Yeah.
You can really go one social event without talking about AGI. So it's an exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, that's awesome. I certainly think I've had this for a while now. I was really interested in natural language processing about 15 years ago, and started reading a lot out of it, and including machine learning or data science as kind of a software layer in our applications that we were building. And I feel like broadly now the rest of the computer science industry is catching up with what was possible. I guess the hype engine is hit. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if people are all the way caught up even. There's still more.
Well, that means we're really excited to see what you build in the future, Cheryl. Absolutely. Yeah.
I hope so.
So I'm curious how the topic area for your paper on the Chrome Web Store, what attracted you and your team to researching this particular space and producing the paper that you did on it?
Yeah, for sure. So I think like cybersecurity is just always really interesting because it's so needed. Like no matter how good AI gets, no matter if like half of the jobs in the world are replaced, like you're still gonna need to be able to defend your systems and keep everything secure. So in terms of the analogy of like build the mining supplies, don't be a gold miner, I think it fits well there. And specifically like browser extensions, it's something that I think, as you mentioned, like everyone, like I've used them before. And it happened to be an area of work that Aurora had done a lot of work in. And specifically in her previous work, she'd focused on like analyzing code to find vulnerabilities. But at the same time, we kind of noticed we were also working on some projects kind of like down that scope in terms of like building an extension that could monitor other extensions. But I think in the end, we kind of realized that there was a big need in terms of no one really had like clear statistics or clear data on kind of the contents of the Chrome Web Store, like even basic things like how many like vulnerable extensions are there, like basic things like how are the reviews,
Yeah.
what's the average review, what's the average number of users, like literally no one really knew, right? So we kind of felt like there was a big need for this that could go far beyond just like developing one specific technique.
Yeah. I certainly have a couple of extensions in my system, and sometimes I go searching and the web store, like when I gotten into Chrome Web Store, it is a little iffy sometimes. I'm kind of like, how can I trust this extension? Did y'all feel the same way in your own utilization?
Yeah, like I don't use Chrome extensions anymore.
No, you've sworn off them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now you have the skills, Cheryl, to write your own extensions, I think. So maybe you could just only do Cheryl trusted extensions.
That's true.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought philosophically about your paper that was really interesting is that you have this idea about security noteworthy, or is an extension security noteworthy? What is the definition to you of something like security noteworthy? How should we should think about that?
Yeah, so I think the definition like in the paper was quite technical or clear cut in that they fall into three categories. They're either malicious, policy violating, or they're vulnerable. So as far as malicious and policy violating, the way we got this is the Chrome Web Store actually releases the reason that an extension was removed in their API. So, like, if you query an extension, it will say it was removed for malware or was removed for policy violations.
Mm,
So those are like very clear cut. It's literally just like what the Chrome Web Store said.
yeah.
But as far as like their definitions, like I think we're pretty familiar with what malware is. As far as policy violating, that's things like, oh, they didn't like write a privacy policy, or their data policy is like not consistent with what the Chrome Web Store wants, or they're requesting too many permissions that they don't need. They're like failing to include some disclaimer that they're like using the data for advertisement, that sort of thing. And then the last category was vulnerable extensions. And, it's overall hard to find vulnerable extensions. No one like, so this was mainly like a set of extensions that had been collected by Aurora with her previous work on like static analysis of code for vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So we have containing malware. So, and I think what I read in some of the data is that malware is going to steal user sensitive data, track users, spy on them, or propagate malware. This seems like the most critical of the security risks, right? Like those would be the extensions we're
Mm-hmm.
most concerned with, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. The next one that you mentioned is the policies. So this is more about didn't meet Google's requirements to, from a policy perspective, to be in the Chrome Web
Mm-hmm.
Store. But it could be like just lack of maturity, like they put together a quick extension but didn't include all the information they need, or they got, real loose with the permission set that they might be asking for.
Yeah, although like Google does vet extensions before they're added the first time. So this is like extensions that are removed. So like hopefully it isn't like completely immature extensions. Like those should never have been improved in the first place.
Yeah. And then finally, containing vulnerabilities, and you mentioned that's the hardest one to kind of to identify, mostly because maybe the
Mhm.
extension is trying to do what it's supposed to do, but the developer didn't write very secure code for that particular
Yeah.
extension, so it's representing a new vulnerability.
Yeah, like for example, a lot of extensions will like they'll need to pass messages between like different pieces of code. So ideally you're gonna like check where the message came from before you do anything with it, right?
Yeah.
Like extensions will like not check. And the next thing you know, like literally anyone could be sending them a message and they're just like executing whatever's sent. So they
Hmm.
are like executing arbitrary code.
Yeah. Oof, that's the scariest. Speaking of which, I'm curious a little bit about the extensions themselves and just the technology feature set that they provide. Is there a typical
Mhm.
language? Are these written in JavaScript, or are there different choices that people can make in coding up an extension?
Yeah, so it's almost entirely written in JavaScript. There'll be like some HTML, CSS for like the UI part, but it's basically all in JavaScript. And then people can just like query their backend or whatever they want, as with like a normal web page.
Okay, so RESTful API typically, or whatever API integration to the backend, the
Yeah,
database. Yeah. And then
just like standard.
from a JavaScript perspective, JavaScript is very package dependent. So I assume that you could embed packages in that extension that you want to in developing that extension from third party developers as well.
Yeah, so like stuff like jQuery, Angular, that
Hmm.
sort of thing. It's quite interesting because we actually found like a lot of use of outdated libraries in terms of like versions of jQuery or Angular that have like known vulnerabilities that are patched, but like developers just don't update. So everyone's kind of using this like old vulnerable version of common libraries.
Yeah. So I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. Like, if I wrote a browser extension, could I? And I'm curious if you could help me say yes or no to, is it possible to do this? For example, let's say that
Yeah.
I created a browser extension and I wanted to look for someone logging into a bank, for example, in their Chrome browser. Could I overlay the login interface of the actual bank login and, on detecting that URL and collect information?
Yeah, so like Chrome extensions can like insert code into the DOM. So like this like allows you to do so many things, right? Like you could add your own HTML, you could add like JavaScript event listeners, all of that. So that just gives you like a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, both powerful, depending on the extension I want to build, and a little scary
Mm-hmm.
about what's possible because we're so thin client oriented from a computing perspective these days that we're going into third party systems for a lot of our data.
Yeah. Like the extension has to list like what sites they're gonna work on.
Okay.
But like there is an option to just hit all sites and the user accepts that and then the extension is on. Like your ad blocker probably works on all sites, right?
Yeah, I think mine does. Yeah. Can I log like key presses? So if someone were in the browser and typing into the interface, can I log keys that are hit?
Yeah, so you can like add an event listener and a button pressed is an event.
Yeah.
So there you are.
And I'm imagining then that I could track and send browsing data to a remote server, right? Like if I have a centralized server and the extension is running, I know what the person is doing in the website and I can send that data back to my remote central server. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean like you have all the keyboard presses. You can also intercept requests. So there's a way to kind of like hook into every request that's made.
Hmm.
And so you can like modify it, you could like discard it, you could log it, track it, whatever you want.
Yeah, and that was my next question actually. Can I control the extension from a remote browser in a way where if I saw a certain interaction happening from the extension, went to my central server, I could push back to that extension activity that I wanted it to do in a very personalized way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that there would be a side of the coin where we'd say this is a powerful set of features for developing really interesting solutions, but also a little scary with the kind of the ease at which we adopt and install these things in our browsers, how central the browser is to deeply uh, private and work that needs security, but they're just living in there and we get to make decisions about them.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. So my next question for you, and you cover this a little bit in the paper, is how pervasive is extensions in Chrome? So, for example, for how many users, how many extensions are we seeing utilized?
Yeah, so with regards to like the number of users, the vast majority of them have like very few users. 64% of them are like have less than 100 users.
Hmm.
And then around like an additional 18% are in the 100 to 1,000 range. So then that leaves like maybe like 14% of extensions that are have like over 1,000 users. But overall, like it's a small amount of extensions that have like the majority of the users. Like 1% of extensions have between 100,000 and a million users, and then just like 0.27% of extensions have over a million users. And then Chrome doesn't give information past like a million, past 10 million.
Gotcha. There's a huge number of extensions that are used by very few users, where they're coming to the
Mm-hmm.
bulk of them, but there's still a lot of them out there, and they do very redundant things, right? Like we see a whole lot of like it's easy to pick the wrong extension essentially for what you're looking for, the best one, right?
Yeah. And I mean, you would hope that like ratings and stuff helps take care of some of that. I think the barrier to like submitting a Chrome extension is very small. Like I've messed around and submitted one before, and it's like $5, like compared to Apple, for example, where they want to charge you like 100 a year, which I think might help.
Yeah.
And as a result, I can definitely see like people just like mess around, like build one in half an hour. They're like,
Yeah.
that'd be cool. It was on the Chrome Web Store and just submit it.
Mm-hmm. And Google does have a group, you mentioned it, that's supposed to review the extensions.
Mm-hmm.
How does that process work? It almost seems more approval focused so they can get as many extensions in than necessarily security minded. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know because they don't actually. I don't know that they get money from like having more extensions in the store necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Versus like, I think people are kind of concerned about the security as we've kind of just seen from like media.
Yeah.
But once again, I'm not Google, so my hypothesis is probably that like they do some amount of like static code analysis where they like just look through the code with some tools. And then there's also like they can flag extensions based on the permissions, right? Because extensions have to request permissions. For example, being able to operate on all sites, being able to like see all your browsing data. So they can like flag extensions that have that like higher that requests more permissions and power and like vet those more thoroughly. I wouldn't be surprised if they were also like running extensions in a sandbox of some sort. I know there's been papers where they use like a honeypot or a honey page, which is like a fake page where they're going to try to see if what the extension does to the page and kind of be able to determine if it's doing anything malicious through that. But I think it's also like a cost benefit thing, right? Like all these things take time to run. They take money to in terms of like compute and everything to be like running these simulations, these tests. So I don't really know like to what level they're doing this and for what level of permissions.
Yeah. And I think I read in your paper that the total number of extensions in the Chrome store is fluctuating a little bit between about 150,000 and 125,000 extensions that people can
Mm-hmm.
pick from. And that's a huge amount, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there's a catch 22 for Google here, and neither of us are Google. That's a given, but it's a little hard, right? I think I can go through the thought process here where Google is like, we cannot build every feature that Chrome can possibly do with our own development team. So we're going to create this
Mm-hmm.
marketplace so that other people can contribute, kind of like we see in the open source marketplace, or packages so that, you know, I wrote this code so you don't have to write it again, or I developed this. They charge for some of them. So just like app stores, maybe Google does make a little money off of each app that is paid for, like there's a percent they get. But then to have to go in and check each one for security over revision after revision, I just don't know that there is enough staff, right? Like it's in the world, it's even at
Yeah.
150,000 extensions, the number of things you'd have to test is going to get really difficult really fast.
Yeah. And it also seems to me like extensions very much break a lot of the web security model. Like, things that are supposed to be able to be handled by like CSRF tokens or like cookie stealing, like stuff that is supposed to be solved by all of these things that we've already implemented. I think
Mm,
like browser extensions break a lot of that. So
yeah. I'm curious, in your paper, were you able to calculate the intersection between the security noteworthy extensions and how many users have adopted them? And I guess what I might be driving at in the end of the day, is there a way to get a probability that any one user has installed an extension that is a security noteworthy?
yeah. I mean, I think when we actually like went and calculated, I think there's like close to like 350 million people who have like used the security noteworthy extension over the last 3 years. And that's like very high, right? There's only like a couple billion people who are using Chrome. So that's like quite a high probability.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to do a little math here. First off, 350 million people have installed a security noteworthy extension at some point. Out of a billion total users, that means 30, you have a 1 in 3 chance of likely installing a security noteworthy extension if 30% of a billion users have already had that experience. That's a huge number. That's not small, right?
Yeah, I mean like there's been like malware containing extensions that have like that have had over 100,000 downloads, right? Like
Yeah.
some of these really popular extensions are actually not that safe.
Yeah. I this thing with the Chrome extensions reminded me of things that we got a lot with malware tools themselves, right? Like I have long had this complaint that antivirus and malware tools, the ones that are supposed to detect and protect us, become
Yeah.
viruses and malware themselves over time. It's really frustrating because
Yeah.
you can't trust that it's it becomes its own enemy in a way. Yeah.
Very ironic.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I guess you have to give all of those tools so much permission and so much access so they can monitor. That's just kind of the danger in of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. In your research, have you learned anything about the developers that are building these extensions, security noteworthy or otherwise? What are some of the trends in the developer community?
Yeah. I think I don't know, there's like a super good sense of like who are these developers, like where are they from, all of that. There are some interesting things, which are that in the past, like people would actually sell and buy extensions. For example, you build an extension, it gets kind of popular, you can sell it to someone else for some amount of money, and then
Mm,
that person might start introducing ads, or they'll start introducing like malware just to like try to make more money off of it. I think another interesting thing is that the Chrome web store doesn't actually like kind of track developers, and that you know how for Apple you can like click on it and it'll show you all the other apps. For the Chrome web store, all you have is like the developer's name or their website. So it's possible that like you have developers who are just all using the same name and they're not actually the same developer, which I think is kind of makes it hard for people to kind of be able to see how good the developer is. And I don't really know why they wouldn't just change it.
yeah. I have a quote from your paper here that I thought was really interesting. And you state in the paper, for example, a developer having published one malicious extension, like a malware extension, publishes on average 3.6 benign and 4.9 malware containing and 1.4 policy violating and 0.00093 vulnerable extensions. So you've found instances of developers having many malicious extensions. And I think that speaks to what you're saying there, which is at the end of the day, someone is writing this extension and being willing to make it security noteworthy, to use a definition. And they're doing a lot of that. But they're kind of, Google is trying to track the extension, not the developer, not requiring identity up front to track who's writing the thing.
Yeah, I think like this kind of goes back to something else that we found in the paper, which is that there's like a lot of very similar code. So a lot of these developers who have like that statistic that you just pointed out, right? Like there were developers who had like many hundreds of like extensions, right? And there were there were clusters of like 800 identical malicious extensions. So it's like, I mean, it kind of makes sense. Like if you have an extension that's doing well, just like copy and paste it, change it a little,
Yeah.
and you have another extension that's doing well and making you more money or whatever your ultimate goal is.
Yeah. The other thing I thought about this data, and you can tell me if I'm misassuming, was that if let's say that I'm creating a malware embedded extension, or there's data I want to exfiltrate from people using a browser, it would behoove me to write a bunch of very benign extensions so that I'm kind of hiding behind all the benign ones with the one that is actually injecting malware, exfiltrating the data that I want.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Tell me, Sheryl, what other changes would you want to see Google make in how they manage the Chrome store? We mentioned one, we'd like clear identity on the developers that are writing it. What are the opportunities for improvement? And not just Google. There's a lot of these marketplaces being adopted, right? Like we could look at app stores as well. We could include a lot of these scenarios. We could look at the package management solutions for JavaScript alone and say, what are the decisions that we could make about being more secure? Would you have any recommendations having done this research?
Yeah, I think just from being in the space, like I think one concern for Google is like definitely fake reviews, especially because Google accounts aren't tied to like phone numbers at all, right? So it's very easy to like for bots to be creating accounts and commenting. So there's actually like quite a few concerns about like fake reviews, and that seems something that's like easy enough to solve, requiring additional verification before commenting on anything or reviewing. So that seems like quite easy to solve. In addition, all Chrome extension code is actually open source right now. So when you like download an extension, it just downloads a zip file, and you unpack that, you have the code. Which firstly seems like, okay, now it's really easy for people to exploit vulnerabilities if they find them. But secondly, is also makes it really easy for someone to like copy an extension because you literally have all the code right now. Just put your ads or your malware in there. So I think like those are two things. And also it seems quite obvious. Like I don't to be able to just like identify duplicate extensions. Like it doesn't seem like it should be that hard for Google to do.
That's interesting. I did not know that the actual code in the extension is open in a way. Like, so if you
Yeah.
download a Chrome extension, I could find where on my computer that extension is stored in my directory and pull up the
Mhm.
JavaScript and take a look at it.
Yeah, that's how we did a lot of this research.
Wow.
I mean, it's great for researchers. I
Yeah,
don't know
that's
that it's
amazing.
great for the general public though.
Well, I don't know. It's a catch-22, right, Sheryl? We all look. I've used a lot of open source tools in my career to build the software that I wouldn't have, if I had to start from zero, I wouldn't have had the time or the opportunity to build. And there's also, I think, a fair argument that when we share code in plain text, we write better code because we get an opportunity to review each other's code and make recommendations. And also, that kind of transparency can help us build better security because we may get recommendation or someone might be looking for vulnerabilities. But in this case, it's got another outcome, which is I can download code from an extension that a lot of people are using, copy that code, inject my malware or ads or whatever violation I want, and upload something that seems to be doing the same exact thing as someone else's extension, but with my extra flavor on top of it, and not really knowing the difference.
Yeah, I think one distinction is, unlike in the open source case, no one is actually gonna like we're not building off of each other's extensions. No one's supposed to be looking through the code
Yeah.
unless like there's no reason anyone should be unless you're like kind of have ill intent.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So we could package it like Google could elect to have these things packaged in some way where they're
yeah,
not
like
readable
encrypt
on
them or
download.
something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that would be an easy change. That wouldn't require a lot of people. It would require a technology change, to implement that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, is the extension space continuing to grow? Like, are we seeing more and more extensions being built as people use browsers more? Or do you think we've kind of reached full saturation on what types of extensions people want to implement?
Yeah, so since 2020, I mean, there's been kind of like a pretty big decline. A lot of that might have been triggered by Google kind of announcing changes like, oh, you need to move to Manifest version 3 from Manifest version 2, or just like new requirements, which might have prompted people who just kind of forgot about their extensions or like didn't really care that much to just take them out of the store.
Yeah.
As far as users, the number is kind of all over the place. Google has a very strange definition of the number of users. When we contacted them to ask them about this, they basically said the number of users displayed on the Chrome Web Store for a given extension corresponds to the number of Chromes, or I guess just like Chrome softwares, with the extension installed that are pinging the update servers over the previous 7 days. So if you have like Chrome on your phone, computer, iPad, whatever, that's going to count as like 3 separate versions. And if you don't use your computer for 7 days because you're on vacation or something,
Yeah.
it wouldn't count. So it's just like a very strange definition. So the trend is like all over the place. And I think it's pretty hard to tell if like overall there are more people using Chrome extensions.
What are the manifests? Actually, I did read about that in your paper, and Google has this version 2, version 3. Can you describe what the manifest means to an extension developer?
Yeah. I mean, I think I kind of think of it a little bit as like a package.json.
Okay.
For like other forms of software. But essentially it's just like a file that where you're gonna write like this is where my code is, this is where like my other code is, this is like where the HTML and CSS that needs to be bundled is, and then these are all of the extensions that I'm requesting, or all the permissions that I'm requesting. For example, I want the permissions to be able to access the cache, the permissions to be able to access the cookie, the permissions to be able to access all the API calls that are being made, and so on. And then also like these are all the sites I want to be able to work on.
Yeah. And so Google they've had a manifest version 2, and then most recently a manifest version 3. Can you help, what is the difference in your mind? What was Google driving at in the manifest v3 work?
Yeah, so I think they rearranged a couple of things in terms of how the code is structured. None of that seems super significant to me from a security standpoint. They're claiming that it'll like improve speed, which is probably true. But from a security standpoint, I think the most interesting thing is that they're disallowing remote code execution, which is pretty big because previously they were allowing that, which obviously, like, I don't even know how you're going to be able to vet extensions if you're going to allow them to like grab code from anywhere and execute them anyways.
Yeah.
So I think like that's probably the biggest change. I think they're also introducing rules that an extension is kind of limited in terms of the websites that it can intercept requests from. Instead of like being able to intercept requests from every single site, they need to like they're limited to like a list of like 50 or something. But I don't know. I don't think that's been like the key point. I think the key point has probably been the remote code execution. As far as timeline, this has been like in the works for quite a few years. You know, they keep talking about it and they keep pushing it back. And they were supposed to have started to disable all extensions that use Manifest version 2 last month. Whether or not it happened is like a very good question.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're going to slowly roll out the rest of it. But
yeah. All right, I'm imagining a conference room in Google headquarters, and they're all sitting around the table, and one person is like, V2 is really insecure, and it's making our Chrome extensions look bad, and we need to force people to go to V3. And the other person on the other side of the table is like, yeah, if we do, we'll lose 90% of the extensions.
yeah, I think that's the problem.
And this is so frustrating for them because now they're like, oh, can we, man, my head would be spinning. I'm like, how can I get these developers to update all these old extensions that is this long tail of users? And it's just impossible, right? Because they weren't tracking, to your point, their identities very discreetly.
Yeah. And like, it's also like, it's a Google account. Like, people have like millions of those, you know?
Yeah.
Go track them down.
Well, I'm just curious also, Sheryl, as we're wrapping up a little bit. First, I'm deeply intrigued by the paper. I really appreciate you and your co-authors digging into this area. I think it's very helpful. You know, as you look forward in your work, you know, certainly your degree and your interests, where do you think you're going? You know, what's next for you, Sheryl, in your computer science career? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm definitely like very interested in machine learning. I've been doing a lot of like NLP work the last couple months. You know, I'm also really excited about robotics. I'm hopeful that robotics will take the next step within our lifetime for sure. And I think like that's something that the people in my generation can play a big role in. It feels like the generation above us got to see and be a part of NLP really transforming the world. And I'm hopeful that my generation will get to, build their eyes of robots in a hopefully like safe way that benefits us all. But beyond that, I think like there's always so much room for security, especially in like ML, trying to figure out how to keep models safe, how to make models safe. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I really like that area. I've in my work in machine learning, one of the things that I've complained about a lot is like security around the models. And for me, a lot of the challenge, like the first challenge that people seem to forget about is running true accuracy measures on their model predictions, right? Like we're happy to get some qualitative answer that seems aligned, but we don't do the hard work of like really testing and publishing, how many false positives or true negatives did I actually get out of a model.
Yeah, and like even beyond that, in terms of like stealing models, right? Like
Mhm.
if we build these models and they're worth billions of dollars, you need to make sure that people aren't stealing them.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get a little science fiction-y here, but I find this topic absolutely intriguing. If you had a model out in the wild and you could ping it with enough data and see its responses, you could almost brute force the model's learning on the other side, right? Like I could steal a model by essentially asking it enough questions to understand reductively how it responds and recreate it.
Yeah, likely.
Yeah.
But are you going to have the money to be able to train that model?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, what's interesting is I worked on some AI tooling a while ago, and we found this really interesting thing. We needed a fair bit of server resources to train our models for the data, but we were working for a high accuracy level. I think we wanted around a 80 to 85% accuracy on the model predictions. We went, we were using a large model method, and we decided to just test out a simple Bayesian model, something that was much, much easier to build, a lot less expensive to run and operate. And I think we were off by like 2 points on our accuracy. And we're like, man, we spent all this money, we used all these GPUs to build this massive model, and we got 2 points extra accuracy out of it. Does anybody really even care? So I do think that there's a balancing act in it sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, Sheryl, we really appreciate you joining the podcast today. Grateful for your paper and your continued work. Keep us apprised as you move forward. And thanks so much for joining Secure Talk.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin. It's been great.